Hello and welcome once again to the Raging Introvert. Today we're going to look at a debate about a month ago or so between Thomas Smith and Sargon of Akkad, also known as Carl Benjamin. Um, you know, there's plenty of videos out there about this discussion. The thing that really stuck out to me that I haven't heard a lot of people kind of pick up on is very rarely do I see in a public forum like this the extreme leftist, the social justice warrior, uh, put on an equal footing for a discussion or a debate like this, and have the crowd and the audience very against the far left social justice warrior, and seeing him trying to react with the crowd booing and jeering his extreme positions and cheering for the side of free speech, liberty, and individual freedoms. Um, Watching him trying to process this and realizing he's the insulated one in the bubble, and he is not the majority, he is the minority, and he is the the opinion that is not mainstream is beautiful. So we'll go through a couple of my favorite clips of that and just kind of enjoy it for a minute. So here they're talking about intersectionality, and he's saying, hey, it makes people more individual and takes factors into consideration. And Sargon saying, no, you're just grouping people. You're making more smaller groups. You're still grouping people into classifications.
But individualism is people should be free. Do you not understand how all of this is completely antithetical to the concept of liberty?
Do you think there's any discrimination against women in our society?
Look, when it comes down to it, let's get down to the principles. You are not for freedom.
Do you think there's any discrimination against women in our society?
Let's get down to the principle. You are for equality of outcome rather than liberty.
Yeah.
That is the fundamental issue of our time, and you should probably know that.
And look at that face. This is 20 minutes in. The 1,000-yard stare. Just he's uncomfortable. He doesn't want to be there because he is flat-footed, outnumbered, and cannot believe what's happening to him. Which, normally, like myself as a conservative, you go out in public and speak. You usually feel outgunned because you get people jeering, and the left does a good job of trying to present you as the minority opinion, even though the country's fairly evenly split. So, just seeing this is amusing.
Do you think there's discrimination against women in our
I
society?
am absolutely certain that there will be someone somewhere who is being discriminated against. Do you think there's discrimination against men in our society?
Not really.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable. Unbelievable.
And again, the audience cheering for the obvious. There is discrimination against both sides. He only seems to care about one. This next one's a little longer, but they're talking about racial discrimination, and again, you'll see he can't even process, really. He doesn't comprehend the argument from Sargon, and again, the crowd's against him.
Your future is oppressive.
Here's the question I have for you. How will you know when not outcome? How will you know when opportunity is equal? How will you know that?
I don't think we can actually give everyone a complete equality of opportunity, right? What we want is just to have any institutional barriers alleviated from people. And affirmative action is placing institutional barriers in front of certain groups of people by trying to specifically privilege other groups of people. You must be able to agree with that. That's not controversial in any way. That's literally the method by which affirmative action works.
What it does is it's a factor of a factor of a factor.
Yes, but what I just described...
If there's two equally qualified candidates and you need a tiebreaker, pick the underrepresented person.
Discriminate based on their race. That's your argument. Racial discrimination. That's what you're advocating for. Against freedom.
You really
And just to pause, he's trying to process. I don't know. Not being in the mind of a liberal, I can never tell. Is he trying to think of a way because he knows he's caught and he doesn't want to say there's discrimination on both sides, or he's discriminating? Does he not actually comprehend that making race a factor in favor of the minorities he thinks are being oppressed. Why doesn't he just come out and say, well, I know why he doesn't come out and say it, because he knows it's horrible. But just seeing that long pause, he's got the jeers, he's got the crowd a little bit at the end there, and just he's sitting there trying to comprehend. I wish I could see what was going on in his mind. I'm jumping around a bit, but this is kind of one of the points where he cracks kind of visibly, which is a little amusing.
So for the audience to follow,
intersectionality has taken over feminism.
okay, what is feminism? And then what is intersectionality? This conference is an embarrassment, by the way. This is an embarrassment. You should be fucking embarrassed.
Why is everyone having
This
such
is
a
the
good time?
crowd. This is the crowd. This is the crowd. This is what you want the movement to be.
Excuse me, the
you want
preacher's
people to be
talking.
yelling. This is what you want the movement to be. Organizers should be fucking embarrassed.
Your movement is...
Yeah, I don't say too much on that one, but it is kind of funny. And again, that's pretty early on in the discussion. He's obviously, again, a little under stress. And I'll link in the description below, but he has a podcast, and if you go, and it's kind of funny. I was expecting this to be fairly short. It's like, yeah, I'll pick out a couple highlights. I'll talk about some of the main points. There's so many little tidbits and nuggets to string together to come up with points. But if you go to this podcast, the next, I don't know, 4 or 5 episodes of his podcast, he keeps talking about this. You know, the first episode, he's kind of beating himself up, and he could have done better. Then he has a guest speaker, Christy Winters, I think her name is, who I hadn't heard of before. And she's kind of bucking him up and saying, no, in fact, you know, you did great, and we won, actually, even though you looked like a fool on stage. We actually got what we wanted. But then they break it down, and they kind of move the goalposts and didn't actually get anything out of it. And then apparently he has a thing where he's been upset about people were saying he was angry, and you know, when the moment he got angry when he lost. And he has like the majority of an episode, the first couple episodes, he's talking about how, well, you know, these people are monsters and they have no empathy, and you know, emotion is good. There's nothing wrong with having some emotion when you're in the face of a monster like Sargon. And he's got an episode later where about half of it is all about studies and things about how empathy and anger and emotion are important, and without it you can't rationally think. And you can tell this whole thing just got in his head and got to him. And it's also, in his podcasts, you do get a bit of a window into his mind, because he seems fairly open and honest about what's bothering him, what he's thinking about, what he thinks he did well and didn't do well. And so, yeah, I'll link it below. And yeah, it's good to see, well, hear his podcast, but good to hear the inner thoughts, the background behind this. I think we'll move on now. We'll talk a little bit about some of those podcasts, some of those clips, and how they relate to certain moments in this discussion. And I think the first thing we'll talk about is, they're talking about Black Lives Matter here, but the idea that data and fact-driven discussions and opinions are more important than emotional feelings-derived opinions, which I agree with. That's the objective way to do things. And maybe it's my bubble, but my assumption or thoughts have always been that the conservative side have been much more fact-driven, and the liberal side much more feelings, emotions-driven. And here, the leftist makes the argument that that he is the fact-driven one, and Sargon, the more moderate, is the emotionally driven one.
Have the data. I'm a data guy.
Yes,
see, you're a feelings person. You feel like there's no discrimination.
Are you insane?
Oh
my God!
My facts do not give a shit that you feel like there's no discrimination.
You have no principles. That's my...
So, okay, that's fine. It is at least good to make that argument. And we'll go through. He does have a lot of facts. The problem is, and if you ever come around here, Thomas, we'll go through some of these points, these major points. So starting here with data and facts, you have a long list of facts. The problem is you're deriving opinions from those facts that aren't backed up by data. And I think the first one he kind of gets to is regarding the number of district attorneys in the U.S. and how many of them are white. So here we'll get to see him quote the stat and then lay out his conclusions from that stat.
That creates more crime.
Okay, that's a great point, because you say, right, we're putting more black men in prison. So yeah, but that's because they're the ones committing the crimes. The individual has to be responsible for their own agency. We can't just like start letting black people
Can I just
go.
give you an example? What happens a lot of times, 95% of all prosecutors in this country are white men, 95%. And if you don't think that bias is affecting the outcome, prosecutorial discretion is one of the biggest tools for this discrimination.
Yeah, but you're saying
and it's
they're all
unconscious.
racist.
So when there's a white guy gets caught with a joint, they say, college kid, screwed up. When there's a black guy gets caught with a joint, they say, this is a drug dealer. We need to put this guy away. They have the discretion to make that call, and bias, unconscious bias, or conscious, I don't know, but one or the other, has drastically...
I don't think you know about the people you're talking about. All of these are, this is the problem, right? You're trying to take a systemic solution to what are individualistic problems.
Yeah.
You can't solve them that way.
Just a dismissive, yeah, Deanne. He's not listening. He doesn't either understand or care about the opposing viewpoint. But see how he thinks he is statistics and data driven. He has a stat: 95% of district attorneys are white, and yes, they do have a lot of power and discretion in how to proceed with cases. But the conclusion he draws, the discrepancy between the number of black people in prison versus white people in prison or charged with crimes, is because of that is feelings driven. If 95% of DAs were black, would he come to the same conclusion that there are more blacks in prison because there are black district attorneys? No, he wouldn't come to that conclusion. Why? See, the statistic he's presented here does not directly impact the percentage of people in prison unless you automatically are assuming that white district attorneys are going to be more lenient for white criminals and more harsh against black criminals. So basically what you're doing is you're just automatically assuming everybody is racist. Now, that may or may not be true, but that's not what the data is. He would need a different statistic to support that claim. Instead, he just inherently assumes it and presents it as a fact-derived conclusion when the statistic he has does not actually support that at all. But and that's typical. And here's a clip from his podcast, and at this point the actual video had not been released, so this is from memory, and he presents it fairly clearly here.
I further made the case. 95% of prosecutors in this country are white. 95%. Prosecutorial discretion is a large source of this bias. When they find a white man who has smoked a joint or whatever, they say, made a mistake. When it's a black kid, he's a drug dealer. This is what drives that discrepancy. It's not black people are criminals, which is literally what Sargon believes, that the crime rate is responsible for the discrepancy.
Prove it. Again, you're making a lot of assumptions for a lot of district attorneys. You know, I would be curious, just as an example, a fact you could maybe throw out there. Okay, 5% of district attorneys are not white. What is the prosecution rate for whites and blacks by those district attorneys against the other 95%? Is there a substantial difference? That would at least be something pertinent and relevant to the conclusion you're drawing. That's not what's presented. In fact, just the percentage, the prosecution rate of whites and blacks for drug crimes. How many people are let off and not charged or have charges downgraded? Does it have to do with money? Maybe the white people are better off socioeconomically and they can get attorneys or better attorneys. You know, there's a lot of different things that could be coming up with the result that you're alluding to, well, there are more percentage-wise, statistically, a higher percentage of black people are in prison compared to the population than white people. That conclusion is correct, but how you're getting to that, what's causing that, is not being supported by your fact and assumptions here. For example, he kept mentioning drug prosecutions, but let's just look at homicide here. According to the U.S. Department of Justice, African Americans accounted for 52.5% of all homicide offenders from 1980 to 2008. Just whatever Wikipedia had first, I found more easily. Whites and at 45.3%, and other at 2.2%. The offending rate for African Americans was almost 8 times higher than whites, and the victim rate 6 times higher. So, unlike drug offenses, homicides are not going to be waived as often, and there's definitely a crime that's been committed when someone's dead. Well, not definitely, but in general, it's much less likely to have been some kind of accident. So this is a much more hard and fast statistic, and African Americans are 8 times higher. That's probably not because of DA prosecutorial discretion. It's probably because African Americans were 8 times more likely to have committed murder or homicide in this case. Now, again, there could be a lot of different reasons for that, and maybe some of it has to do with the justice system. But this statistic is much closer to the mark for showing an actual nexus between the number of blacks incarcerated and the number of crimes committed, and it does not support Mr. Smith's conclusion. There are other data and statistics he quoted as well. I'm not going to go into every one of them, but just in general, Thomas, if you're listening, make sure your data is more closely tied to your conclusions. We're getting a little long, so I won't go through the rest of those. I do want to kind of lead off on, or end with, some of the thoughts that he presented in his podcast after the fact that, again, as a conservative, struck close to me. It was nice to hear someone from the other side encountering, which I'm assuming he's encountering probably for the first time. We'll start with a clip of him explaining from his podcast how he felt the day of the event and how he got to walk in the shoes of a conservative on a college campus. The reality they face every day, how he got to experience it for a brief moment, and how he felt about that.
Here's what I also knew. When I went to this event, when I went to the green room, etc., and for anyone I met, for anyone I saw, I had no way of knowing, is this a friendly person or is this a person who cheers online abuse? Is this a friendly person or is this a person who hates my guts, who blames me for everything they think every SJW has done, who cheers on sexual harassment, online abuse, rape jokes, who thinks it's funny? Is that the person I'm meeting? I was incredibly anxious and I was incredibly reticent to talk to anyone, to meet anyone. Imagine just not knowing if anyone you're meeting hates you and supports these disgusting, cruel things. It was not fun. It was unpleasant. And as such, there were some people who tried to talk to me, who introduced themselves before the event, and I was not very friendly, and I apologize.
No, Thomas. No conservative could ever imagine walking around on a college campus wondering, who can I talk to? If I tell this person over here I voted for Trump, or I believe that men and women are both discriminated against, and instead of affirmative action, people should be treated equally, and the law shouldn't treat them equally. I can't imagine someone saying you're a Nazi and punching me in the face for something like that, or saying you're a horrible white supremacist, heteronormative, cisgendered, privileged white male, and your opinion doesn't count. No conservatives ever had to deal with that every freaking day of their life. So, no, it was good to hear good to hear someone from the other side actually experience that, the typical day in a conservative's life, and trying to process and deal with that. It, I hate to say it, but it was a little bit of Schadenfreude too, just knowing that someone else experienced it from the other side. Now, one of the ways that conservatives have learned to kind of get around these kind of problems with dealing with strangers and not knowing who you're talking with is to open up and kind of show some humanity. Despite our differences, we're all just people. And liberals always love to talk about how they really care about people and individuals. So, and that's true. We may have disagreements, we may have arguments about things, but deep down inside, we're all people, and we just want to get along and live and let live. So let's see how Thomas dealt with that that particular angle for interacting with people. He's talking about meeting Carl backstage before the event here. Let's see how that went.
And before this, during this, at some point, the timeline's a little messy. It was very stressful. I don't have perfect memory of it, but at some point he said in his introduction early on, he's like, I'm really a nice guy, and I refused to buy into that bullshit because I know exactly who he is. And I said, well, something like, well, we'll see, he was stunned by that.
Yeah, I can imagine. Look, he's just, introducing, trying to be nice. Like, look, I'm a nice guy. Just, another person like you. I just want to sit down and chat. That was bullshit. I didn't believe it. I've never met this person in my life. I've just seen stuff online about him. But I've already made up my decision. He's a Nazi. I wish I could punch him on stage. So, yeah, that's when you go into meeting people with that kind of attitude, yeah, that's going to put you on edge because you're projecting. That's what most people do, right? You when you have a thought, when your brain thinks in a certain way, and you're making decisions about people, you're assuming they're going to be thinking the same way back. So you're going around thinking, everyone's going to hate me, everyone's going to know who I am, because that's what you're thinking. It's incredible, but it's good to hear. I'm getting it along, so I'm going to wrap up with a longer quote, kind of an extended quote, from Thomas talking about at the end of the event how he felt and how it affected him.
About kind of my conclusions. Initially, I was incredibly upset after the debate. I thought I had let people down in a lot of ways. I was disappointed with myself. It was traumatic. Hearing people cheer for sexual harassment is awful. And if it's your view that I'm somehow weak for finding that awful, I'm weak for having compassion and emotion when I hear something terrible like that, fine. I'm weak by your definition. I do not care about your definition. It is not important to me. What's important to me are my values. But I want to emphasize that I'm not trying to get pity, but this was really hard. That was one of the worst days I've ever had. It was.
Yeah. That performance wasn't weak by my standard. That performance was weak by any standard. You went in with the wrong attitude, confrontational, thinking that Sargon is a monster, instead of treating him just like a human being and discussing, like Sargon tried to do. He talked about repeatedly. He wanted to talk about principles, the bottom line. Why are we making these decisions? Why do you hold the views you do? And you're trying to talk minor specific points instead of the fundamental principles. And I can imagine it's a traumatic experience. I imagine it's traumatic to go out in public and have your bubble shattered so visibly for the whole world to see. That and Sargon even mentioned it in the debate. He said, your movement is small and weak and crumbling, something along those lines. Because it's true. The media is controlled by liberals that support social justice warrior beliefs and attitudes, and in the past they've been able to control access. So even though we know from voting and such that in general the public is relatively split on these things, it's controlled in such a way that it looks like, through discussions, through what's put on the news, online, through the control of the media, it looks like the social justice warriors on the mainstream, that this extreme left-wing progressive ideology is the norm, and conservatives have always felt in the minority. But as social media gets more widespread and easier to access by just normal people, it suddenly that monopoly of power in communications is broken up, and people can begin to see that no, I'm not in the minority. My beliefs and views are more mainstream, and those people who I always thought were crazy, extreme left-wing nut jobs, they are the small minority. And it was heartening. It was so heartening to hear the audience booing those extremist social justice warrior beliefs and views, and knowing, this event is called like Mythicist, Wisconsin, which I didn't know anything about, and it's strangely enough, it's supposed to be an atheist convention of some sort. So, in my mind, it's kind of weird seeing this discussion going on because it had very little to do with atheism. But in the back of your mind, the audience is going to be fairly young and fairly moderate. You wouldn't think of it as being hardcore fundamentalist Christian type conservatives. I'm conservative, atheist myself, but you would imagine the group in general, the audience, would be either more moderate or even left wing in some ways. But even they're not going to put up with this crap anymore, and they're tired of it. And that gave me a lot of hope, which is something that as a conservative who's hunkered up quite a bit, you don't have as much. And just hearing it, a younger audience, a more moderate audience, booing this stuff down, which is good to hear. So, I'm getting a little long. I have to break this up into a couple more episodes. I think the next episode, let's see what we're going to talk about. They talk quite a bit about in Thomas's podcasts. The second one he did after this event, he had Christy Winters again, or whatever her name is. In fact, we can look up here. What is her name? Yes, Dr. Christy Winters. They talk about Kekistan quite a bit, and Kekistan was brought up once or twice in the debate as well. And it's just hilarious. It's a great example of how the left has no sense of humor, because they're analyzing Kekistan and trying to figure out, and what does Kekistan really mean? Well, I don't, it could mean this. I've heard this. No, it means this, and just hearing people try to discuss it intellectually and not understanding something is just a joke. Is hilarious. We'll talk about, they brought up intellectualism quite a bit, and how Sargon is non-intellectual, and the anti-intellectual right-wing movement. Sargon brought up in the debate, he mentioned that the extreme left, acts as a mafia to keep people in line, and we'll show some clips and highlights and discuss that a bit, because it's true. It's very true. When you start hearing some of the things that Thomas said in his podcast, he's very blunt about it, and he may not even understand just how much control and power he wants, and how ruthless the left is in trying to enforce rigid ideology. And through some of these clips, they talked about intersectionality a little bit here and there, but we'll dive more deeply into it. Explaining what it is, showing the differences, and how crazy it is when Thomas talks about how intersectionality makes people more free and lets us view people more as individuals. And Sargon says it's bullcrap, because it is. And so we'll delve into those topics next episode. And who knows? Like I said, I thought at first to just make a quick little topic about how it was good to hear younger, moderate people cheering freedom and liberty and booing and jeering the social justice extremism. And as I started going through the video and listening to the podcast and just taking notes, time codes of when I hear certain things, I came up with 2 sheets worth of just little snippets here and there. And just go watch the debate, go to Thomas Smith's podcast, listen to me. You got, episode 82, the Myth-Information Shit Show, episode 83, where he talks with Christy Winters, another good one. I did not know Christy Winters, and it's funny, after watching this, I looked her up on YouTube, and yeah, she's got some good feminist extremist stuff as well, which is always good to listen to. I don't remember listening to 84 or not. And this one I didn't listen to at all. But 86, again, he comes back talking about the event, and like I said earlier, emotion is critical to reasoning. So many of these topics just got into this guy's head and just kept eating away at him, and he didn't pull the right lessons from this debate discussion and just overreacted. So it's great. Listen to it all. Thanks for listening, and hopefully I'll have the next episode for this out in a day or two.